The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road as I drove deeper into the unknown. It had been hours since I passed the last gas station, and the further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The winding road stretched endlessly, and I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. There was something unsettling about being so far from everything familiar, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the strange stillness of the landscape, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 7 p.m., and the light was fading fast. My headlights flickered briefly, then steadied, casting a narrow beam of light on the asphalt ahead. I didn't know where I was headed, but I had to keep moving. The old map I had pulled from the glove box was practically useless in this digital age, but I'd been trying to take the back roads for the sake of some quiet, alone time. I regretted it now. There were no other cars, no signs of life. It felt like I was the last person on Earth, swallowed up by this endless stretch of highway. The trees had grown denser, their branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable canopy above me. The road twisted like a snake, each turn revealing only more of the same. Dark woods, empty stretches, and a growing sense of unease. My phone had lost signal a while ago. No bars. Not that it mattered much. I didn't need anyone reaching out. I just didn't like being cut off from the world. I reached for my water bottle on the passenger seat, trying to distract myself from the nagging feeling creeping into my chest. Then, without warning, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A car, parked but no one inside. A rusted old sedan, its paint chipped and faded. The engine hood was slightly ajar, as if the car had broken down and the owner had just walked off, leaving everything behind. I slowed, my heart pounding in my chest, but the strange stillness of the place seemed to hold me in its grip. It was like the air had thickened. I could have passed by, kept going, but something pulled me toward it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need for a break from the endless isolation. I pulled over slowly, stopping just behind the abandoned car. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the air heavy, thick with silence. I stared at the empty sedan, wondering who had left it behind and why. I got out of my car and approached the other vehicle cautiously, scanning the surroundings. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no obvious signs that anything had happened here. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before peeking inside. The interior was old, dusty, and worn. The seat belts were frayed, the upholstery torn. It smelled faintly of something stale, like it had been abandoned for months, maybe years. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. A subtle scent, almost like a mix of damp earth and something metallic. My skin prickled. I opened the door wider, cautiously stepping inside, half expecting to find a hidden body or something that would explain the car's abandonment. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faint smell and a strange chill in the air that seemed to seep from the car itself. I stepped back, my hands trembling slightly, my mind racing with questions. Why was this car here so far from civilization? Had it broken down? Was someone lost in the woods? But as I stood there, staring at the sedan, the unsettling feeling deepened. I didn't belong here. This place, this road, felt wrong. I decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as I turned back to my car, a sound stopped me in my tracks. A rustling noise coming from the woods. I froze, every muscle tensed. The sound came again, closer this time. Branches shifting, twigs snapping. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to shout to whoever or whatever was out there, but my voice seemed to stick in my throat. Then I saw something. A figure. a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally fast. Too fast for a person, too erratic in its movements to be anything normal. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood frozen, watching as the shadow darted from one tree to another, its outline barely visible in the dimming light. I couldn't make out details, just the movement, and it was coming closer. I stumbled back toward my car, every instinct telling me to drive, to get out of here as quickly as possible. But as I reached the door, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the handle, unsure. There was no one else around. No cars. No signs of civilization for miles. The shadow had stopped moving. For a long moment, the silence returned, heavier than before. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to calm myself, to think clearly. Was it just a deer? Some animal? But then, there was that feeling again, the sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I slammed the car door shut and started the engine, the sound of the engine breaking the eerie quiet. The headlights flickered again, but this time they didn't settle. I had no choice but to keep going. The road ahead twisted and turned as the sky grew darker. I pushed the gas pedal harder, my mind racing. That shadow had been no animal. It had been something else. Something wrong. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the endless road becoming a tunnel that closed in around me. My headlights illuminated the way, but it felt like I was driving into an abyss. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road behind was empty. I took another turn, and that's when I saw it. A house, a small, run-down cabin barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on any map. There were no signs, no indication that it was even there. My heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of place you read about in stories, the kind of place people get trapped in. I slowed, staring at the cabin in disbelief. There were no lights on, but the door was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. My instincts screamed at me to keep going, to drive away and never look back. But something in my gut told me that I had to stop. Something was pulling me toward it. I parked by the side of the road and cut the engine. The night was thick around me, suffocating. My headlights illuminated the cabin, casting long shadows on the overgrown lawn. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was colder now, the silence even heavier. I approached the door slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the threshold, I hesitated. Should I go in? Should I knock? Or was this a mistake? I reached out and pushed the door open, the creaking sound loud in the quiet. The inside was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from a small oil lamp on the table. The place was dusty, abandoned. Nothing but old furniture, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs. But there, sitting on the table, was a map of the very area I had been driving through. I walked closer, my breath caught in my throat as I examined the map. It was old, worn, and marked with strange notations, circles, lines, and strange symbols that made no sense. But then my eyes stopped on a particular mark, a spot that seemed to be near where I had turned off the main road. And then I saw it, a note, written in shaky handwriting. "You are not supposed to be here." I had always thought that being alone in the wilderness wouldn't be so bad. I mean, it's peaceful, right? The fresh air, the sound of nature, the absence of distractions. At least that's what I convinced myself of when I signed up for this solo camping trip. I had done it before, sure, but this time was different. I wasn't just heading into some well-traveled park. No, I chose a place far off the beaten path. The kind of place that made me feel like I was truly escaping everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a time to reset. But now, looking at the winding trail that led deeper into the woods, A strange sense of unease crept up on me. Something felt off. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. That feeling you get when you're far from home, far from any sign of civilization. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail as I hiked deeper into the forest. The birds chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees. It was peaceful, just as I had imagined. I had packed my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the essentials. I wasn't expecting any problems, at least not major ones. But there was something about this place that didn't sit right. Maybe it was how quiet it was. No sounds of animals, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail was narrow and winding, and the trees grew thicker around me, their gnarled roots protruding from the ground like twisted fingers. It was getting darker, and the temperature was dropping. I found a small clearing and decided it was as good a spot as any to set up camp for the night. I dropped my backpack to the ground and began unpacking. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The air felt heavier, thicker. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I dismissed it as nerves. The wind whispered through the leaves, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, someone, moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I paused, holding my breath, but there was nothing, just the usual rustling of the wind. I laughed at myself. "You're just being paranoid," I muttered aloud. There was no one out here, just me, alone in the wilderness. But still, that sense of being watched lingered, pressing down on me. After a quick meal, I sat by the fire I'd built, the crackling flames providing a small comfort in the growing darkness. The warmth felt good against the chill in the air, and the smoke curled up into the sky, vanishing into the trees. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to relax, but the unease wouldn't go away. It was as if the silence was too thick, too complete. The forest felt empty in a way that was hard to describe. It was as though the usual sounds of wildlife had been muted, as if something was keeping them away. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Night settled in, and with it, the sounds of the forest became distant and strange. The wind was still, but the air was unnaturally cold, and I could feel it creeping into my bones. I retreated into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The rustling of the leaves outside had stopped, and the silence was overwhelming. Too quiet. I pulled the sleeping bag over me, but sleep wouldn't come. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise, like someone, moving outside the tent. The sound was soft, deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening intently. There it was again, the rustling of leaves, the crunch of twigs snapping underfoot. I held my breath, trying to control the panic rising in my chest. Could just be an animal, I reasoned. But why did it feel so deliberate, so human? I reached for the flashlight by my side and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the quiet. I stayed up for hours, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to make any noise. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept my flashlight within reach, my hand on the handle, ready to shine it at the slightest disturbance. But nothing happened. The forest was still. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep out of sheer need. I woke up the next morning with the light of dawn streaming through the trees. I was stiff, my body sore from lying in a strange position all night. But the first thing that hit me wasn't physical pain, it was the silence. The eerie, oppressive silence that greeted me when I unzipped the tent. The usual birds weren't chirping. There was no hum of insects, no sounds of small animals in the underbrush. The wind wasn't even stirring the branches. It was as though the world had stopped turning. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. I didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary. Something felt wrong. Something had been wrong last night, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I hiked back down the trail, moving faster than usual, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the forest felt different. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on me, the trail narrowing with every step I took. The air seemed heavier, as though the trees were pressing down on me. It was harder to breathe, and my chest felt tight, my heart racing as if urging me to run. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, but that only made the dread settle deeper into my stomach. I had to stop and take a breath. My mind was playing tricks on me, my imagination running wild. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached a fork in the trail, a point where I knew I should have seen the main path leading back to my car. But when I looked, the trail ahead seemed unfamiliar, as if it had changed overnight. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart skipped a beat. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, I was sure this was the way I'd come. But the more I looked, the more I doubted myself. The trees looked different, the ground uneven in a way I didn't remember. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible, hidden by the shadows. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as my heart pounded in my ears. For a split second, I thought it was just another figment of my imagination. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from behind a tree. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them on me, piercing through the dark. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. He just stood there, watching me, and then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I waited, holding my breath, my body shaking. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before I could move again. When I finally managed to take a step forward, I ran. I ran like I had never run before, not looking back, not caring where I was going, just away. I don't know how long I ran or how far I went, but eventually, I stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a house in the distance. I walked there, my legs trembling, my body covered in sweat despite the chill. I didn't stop to talk to anyone. I didn't need to. I just needed to be away, to be around people again where it was safe. I made my way to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I still don't know what happened that day in the woods. Was it a person? A figment of my imagination? I'll never know. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back to those woods again. And maybe, just maybe, some places are meant to stay untouched. That feeling, the dread, the silence, the sensation of being watched, has never really left me. It lingers like a shadow, always just out of sight. And as much as I try to ignore it, I can't help but feel that something is still out there, waiting. But I'm done looking. I've always preferred solitude. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, When I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue, but this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need: a tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried. This was my element. I was used to it. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch. It was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds. Footsteps, breathing, but it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. It started as just another ordinary road trip, something to break up the monotony of life. I needed to clear my head, get away from the noise of the city, and enjoy some quiet time. I packed my things, grabbed some snacks, and left before the sun came up. The highway was mostly empty at that hour, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, this trip would help me find the peace I was craving. I didn't have a set destination. I just knew I wanted to go far, away from everything. The road stretched out before me, smooth and uninterrupted. For the first few hours, the world outside my car was a blur of open fields and occasional farms. As I passed through small towns, I could see the houses tucked away behind rows of trees, the kind of places that seemed frozen in time. I had seen signs for a scenic route earlier on, and when I passed one with a faded green arrow pointing down a side road, I decided to take it. The idea of driving through untouched nature sounded appealing. I turned off the main highway and onto a smaller, winding road. The pavement was rougher here, and the trees grew thicker along the edges, casting long shadows in the early morning light. At first, I thought it was beautiful, the quiet, the peace, the crisp air that came through the open window. But the longer I drove, the more I realized that something wasn't quite right. The further I went, the less I saw of civilization. No houses, no farms, not even other cars on the road. Just trees. Tall, dense trees. The kind that seemed to close in around me as I moved forward. I thought it was probably just a small, isolated area that people didn't visit much. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel the weight of isolation pressing in on me. I slowed down, my eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for something, anything, that might make me feel less alone. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of road ahead. It felt like I had been driving for hours, though I couldn't be sure. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the heat started to make the car feel stuffy. I rolled the window down again, but even that didn't help much. It was as if the air itself was thicker here, heavier, somehow. And the silence, it was strange. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the oppressive, thick silence that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't hear any birds or insects, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the road. After what felt like forever, I came to a fork in the road. A wooden sign was nailed to a nearby tree, but the letters were faded, barely readable. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to make them out, but it didn't matter. Neither direction looked like it led anywhere I recognized. I chose to go left, reasoning that it would loop around and eventually bring me back to the main highway. I had no real plan other than to keep going. The road narrowed as I continued, becoming more and more like a trail. I had to slow down even further, carefully steering the car around bends that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The trees were so close now, their branches brushing against the sides of the car. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. It wasn't the feeling of someone directly observing me, but more like the sensation of the world around me holding its breath, waiting. My phone had no signal. I had expected this, but it still made me uneasy. I'd hoped to get some radio reception, at least, but the static-filled channel I had found didn't offer any comfort. Every now and then, the sound would break, and I'd hear something else. A low, almost imperceptible hum or a faint clicking noise, like something was just out of range, too distant to understand. But it was enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't stop. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to keep moving. My mind told me to turn around and go back, but I ignored it. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I was just looking for something. Some sort of clarity, a reason to keep going forward. But as the road twisted and turned, I began to notice something odd. The trees, they were getting weird. Some of them were bent at strange angles, their trunks twisting unnaturally, like they had been pulled or pushed into shape. And the leaves, they didn't seem to belong. They were too dark, almost black, and they moved even though there was no wind. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself that it was just the lighting, that the trees had always looked like that. But the unease in my chest grew. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in around me. The road ahead, which had seemed endless before, now seemed to have a destination, but I wasn't sure if it was somewhere I wanted to go. I pressed on. Then, after a few more miles, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just that it was hotter or thicker. It was as if something fundamental had changed. The sounds of the forest, whatever little sounds had been there, stopped. The world became unnervingly quiet again, and this time, it felt like it was suffocating. The only noise left was the hum of the car and my own breathing. I didn't know how much longer I could go like this. My instincts were telling me to turn around, but I couldn't. It was like the road was pulling me forward, like I didn't have a choice. The trees, the air, the silence, they all felt like a warning. Then I saw it. Up ahead, barely visible through the trees, there was something on the side of the road. It was hard to make out at first, but as I drew closer, it became clearer. A small, rundown house, sitting off the road, hidden in the forest. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone live out here, miles from the nearest town? The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and a roof that had clearly seen better days. but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. I slowed down as I passed by, my eyes darting toward it, half expecting someone to appear in the window. But there was nothing, just the empty house, like it had been forgotten by time. And then, just as I was about to pass it completely, I saw something else, a figure standing by the front door. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that looked out of place in the heat. His face was obscured by the shadows of the house, but his posture, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't just that he was standing there, it was how still he was, how unnaturally still, like he wasn't even breathing. I didn't stop, couldn't. Something in me told me to keep moving, to not make eye contact. I sped up, my heart racing, and didn't look back. The road ahead was darkening now, the trees growing closer again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something wrong. Minutes passed in silence. My hands were gripping the wheel, knuckles white. I don't know how long I drove like that, just trying to shake the image of the man from my mind. Eventually, I passed another fork in the road, one that I hadn't noticed before. This one, though, was different. The road to the right was well maintained, as if it had been used recently, but it didn't seem to lead anywhere in particular. I took it anyway, desperate for a way out, for anything that would take me back to civilization. The road curved, and before long, I noticed something else. The trees on this side of the road had started to look even stranger. Their branches were twisted into shapes that resembled figures. The more I looked, the more they seemed to take form, as if the forest itself was trying to tell me something. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I stop and try to figure out what was going on? Or should I keep going and hope this was all just my imagination playing tricks on me? I kept going. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. It felt like time had stopped altogether. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I saw something that made everything click. A sign. A road sign, barely visible through the trees. I pulled up to it, the gravel crunching under my tires as I parked beside it. The sign was worn, faded, but the name on it was clear. Welcome back. I froze. The words felt like a joke, a cruel twist of fate. This road, this place, it wasn't a dead end. It wasn't isolated or abandoned. It was a loop. I was back where I started. I stared at the sign for a long time, my mind racing, trying to process everything that had happened. It wasn't supernatural, and it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. The house, the figure, the twisted trees. This road was designed to lead me back, to trap me. But just as my panic set in, I realized something else. There was no figure standing by the road anymore. No strange houses.
No oppressive silence.
And for the first time since I'd started this journey, I heard a bird chirp. The forest wasn't empty anymore, and I was free. I knew then that the road hadn't been leading me into some endless loop. It had been leading me to a choice, and I chose to go home. I never liked driving at night. It's not the darkness or the quiet that unsettles me, but the isolation. When you're on the road, miles away from the nearest town, there's nothing but the hum of the engine, the occasional flicker of headlights in the rear view, and the blackness stretching ahead. It's in that emptiness where things feel like they could go wrong. And when you're in the middle of nowhere, it's as if the world forgets you exist. That night, though, I had no choice but to drive. I'd been at my uncle's cabin up in the mountains, a small getaway spot we'd used as a place of refuge for years. It wasn't fancy, just a simple log cabin with a porch that overlooked miles of dense woods. He'd passed a few weeks earlier, and I was there to clean things up, get rid of the old furniture, and lock up for the last time. The weather had been strange all day. Overcast skies, thick and heavy, hanging low, almost as if they were about to drop something. I hadn't planned on staying that late, but as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows lengthened, I realized I wouldn't be able to make it back to the city until well after dark. I packed up my things quickly, took one last look at the empty cabin, and started the drive back down the mountain road. My car, an older model, sputtered as I shifted into gear. The engine sounded fine, but something about the way it hummed in the cold, lonely air made me uneasy. The road I was on was narrow, winding, and carved through thick forests. Trees on both sides of me stretched their branches toward the sky, like they were reaching to grab the car and pull me into the blackness. There weren't any streetlights, no signs of civilization. The further I went, the more the road seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The road seemed to go on forever, and I had a feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the silence, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made you feel small and insignificant. My headlights barely cut through the night, casting long, sharp shadows across the road ahead. I wasn't sure how long I had been driving, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to distort in this place, as if I were moving through some kind of limbo. I checked the map on my phone again. The screen showed nothing but a long stretch of road with no end in sight. I cursed under my breath and tapped the gas pedal, trying to force myself to feel normal. But then, something in the distance caught my eye. I almost didn't notice it at first. It was a flicker of light, just a small dot in the distance, but it was enough to make my heart skip. I thought it might be another car coming the opposite way, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car's headlights. It was something off. The light was too steady, too still, and it didn't move. It was like a small lantern just floating in the dark, right in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my tires crunching over the gravel, as I stared at it. For a moment, I thought about turning around, but there was no place to turn around. The road was too narrow, and I had already passed the last turnoff miles back. As I got closer, I could see more clearly that it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a faint, pale light coming from a small structure, a shack. It looked abandoned, worn down. Its dark wood was peeling, and the roof had collapsed in places. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What was a shack doing out here, miles from anything? There was no reason for it to be there. I pulled the car to a stop a good distance away from the shack. I wasn't sure what drew me to it, but I couldn't just drive past. I had to check it out. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't leave without understanding what it was. I killed the engine and stepped out into the night. The air was freezing, biting my skin. I wrapped my arms around myself as I stared at the shack. There was no sign of life, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. I took a few steps toward it, crunching the gravel beneath my boots. The light, now that I was closer, appeared to be coming from a small window on the side of the building. It was dim but steady, casting faint shadows on the ground. I had no idea where it was coming from. I reached for the door, which hung loosely on its hinges. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The inside was a mess. Old furniture, broken bottles, and crumpled papers were scattered across the floor. A faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. But what caught my attention immediately was the strange arrangement in the corner of the room. There was a large wooden crate, the kind used for storing old supplies. It was sitting upright, surrounded by what looked like dirt, but the dirt was in small, neatly arranged piles. In the middle of these piles was a small, unmarked bottle. The liquid inside it was clear, but there was something unsettling about it. The bottle looked out of place in the chaos of the shack. My heart was pounding now. I had to leave. I had to get back in the car and drive away. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body was paralyzed by some invisible force. I took a step closer to the crate, my shoes scraping the floor. As I moved, I noticed something strange. There was something written on the side of the crate. It was scrawled hastily in a dark red substance. I couldn't tell if it was paint or something else. It read, "Don't let it out." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, staring at them. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Everything inside me screamed to leave, to turn around and run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The light in the window flickered, then dimmed, and that's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the back of the shack. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The room was still, silent. For a long moment I waited. My mind raced, but my body remained frozen. Then slowly, ever so slowly, I heard it again. The scraping sound, louder now, closer. It was as if something or someone was moving around in the dark. I felt a sudden wave of panic wash over me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran back to the door. As I reached for the handle, a low, guttural sound filled the air. It was a growl, deep and primal. I slammed the door open and sprinted back to the car. My heart was hammering in my chest as I fumbled for the keys, trying to get the engine started. My hands were shaking, and for a moment, I couldn't get the key in the ignition. The growling came again, louder now and closer. I felt the weight of it in my bones. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what it was. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched as I spun the car around, kicking up gravel behind me. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. I drove and drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, hours away. I didn't know what had happened back there, but I knew one thing for certain. There was something out there, in the middle of nowhere, something I couldn't explain, something I would never understand. The road had ended, but the feeling of being followed never did. I never liked driving at night, especially not through the middle of nowhere. But when my car broke down, it was too late to turn back, and there wasn't a single town for miles. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, the road stretching endlessly ahead, with trees lining both sides. Not a single light, not a single sign of life. It had been a long, tiring day. I'd been on the road for hours, hoping to make it to my cousin's house before the weather turned. The storm had been building all day, a slow, relentless thing, and now it was here. The sky was thick with clouds, dark and swollen, and the wind had started to pick up. The rain was coming down hard, beating against the car with a steady rhythm that almost drowned out everything else. My windshield wipers barely kept up, streaking the glass in frantic sweeps as I drove. I had just passed the last exit for miles when the car made a noise. A soft, almost inaudible click, and the engine sputtered. The lights flickered once, then went dark. I pressed on the gas, but nothing happened. The car rolled to a slow stop in the middle of the highway. The rain continued to pour down, and I sat there for a moment, completely still, trying to process what had just happened. Great, I thought, just great. I tried the ignition again, but nothing. I checked the gas gauge, plenty of fuel. The engine wasn't turning over. I cursed under my breath. I didn't have a phone charger with me, and I wasn't even sure which direction the nearest town was. I'd been driving through this remote area for so long that I had no idea how far I was from anything resembling civilization. The rain was getting heavier now, the sound pounding against the roof like the sky itself was angry at me. I turned on the hazard lights, hoping someone would come by, though I knew it was unlikely. This stretch of road was almost deserted. I wasn't even sure if there were any gas stations or rest stops nearby. There wasn't even a shoulder to pull off onto, just a narrow, two-lane highway cutting through a dense forest on both sides. I glanced around, seeing nothing but trees, dark and unmoving. The road felt like it was swallowing me whole, the isolation pressing in. I had no choice but to get out of the car. I grabbed my jacket, a thick fleece one that I always kept in the back seat for just such emergencies, and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit me immediately, and the rain soaked through my jacket in no time. The wind bit at my face, and I squinted into the storm, trying to see if I could make out anything in the distance. There was nothing, just blackness and rain. I popped the hood and stepped around to the front of the car, hoping to see something obvious that might explain the breakdown. There was nothing that seemed out of place, though. The engine looked fine, no smoke, no strange smells. I fiddled with a few things, trying to remember what I'd read about car troubles in the past. Nothing worked. I didn't want to stand out here in the rain for too long, so I got back in the car, slamming the door behind me to shut out the storm. The cold was seeping into my bones, and I felt a creeping sense of panic building in my chest. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find help, but there was no cell service, no signs of life. Just trees, darkness, and the never-ending rain. The sound of the rain hitting the roof grew louder, almost deafening, but I didn't dare get out again. My mind kept running in circles, thinking about the worst-case scenarios, wild animals, bandits, something worse. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about this place, something more than just the isolation and storm. I stared at the empty road ahead, waiting for anything to happen. Minutes dragged by, and the storm didn't let up. The car seemed to groan under the weight of the rain. It was also silent, except for the sound of the rain and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. Then, as if out of nowhere, I thought I heard something, a rustling in the trees off to the side of the road. I froze, listening. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but the sound came again, louder this time. I stared into the blackness, trying to make sense of it. It didn't sound like an animal. No, this was different. Something was moving out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. My heart started to race, and I quickly locked the car doors, even though I knew there was no one to be seen. I reached over to the glove compartment and pulled out the flashlight I always kept in there. The beam of light flickered as I switched it on, and I pointed it toward the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. There was nothing. Just rain-soaked branches swaying in the wind, a few leaves fluttering down, but nothing more. I shook my head, trying to calm my nerves. It was just the storm playing tricks on me, I thought. Maybe I was imagining things. But as the seconds passed, that creeping unease didn't fade. It only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. But I was too afraid to open the door again and check. The minutes passed slowly, like hours, as I sat in that car. The feeling of being watched never left, and my nerves were fraying at the edges. Then, just when I thought I might be losing my mind, something changed. The wind died down for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, everything was silent. I heard it, a soft, slow crunch of footsteps on the wet ground. I froze. My eyes darted to the trees, searching the darkness for any movement. The footsteps were too soft to be an animal. They were deliberate, heavy, as though someone or something was walking slowly toward my car. My breath caught in my throat, and my hand instinctively moved to the door handle, though I had no intention of getting out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was something about them that felt wrong. They didn't sound like a person. There was no rhythm to the steps, no normal pace. It was like whoever or whatever was walking was unsure of itself, hesitant, almost dragging itself along. I could feel my pulse in my ears now, the fear making it impossible to think straight. My eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just dark shadows in the rain. But I could still hear the footsteps, the strange, dragging footsteps that were getting closer and closer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing right behind me, but there was nothing. The road stretched out empty in both directions. But then, I saw something flicker in the trees to my left. A shadow, quick and unnatural, darting between the trunks. My stomach churned. Suddenly, I heard a thud on the roof of the car. I jerked back in my seat, my heart leaping into my throat. What the hell was that? The rain kept pouring, but the sound of footsteps on the ground had stopped. Now, all I could hear was the strange scraping noise coming from above. It was faint, like something heavy was slowly dragging across the roof, but I couldn't see anything through the windshield. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The minutes stretched on. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door and check? Should I drive away, even though I had no idea if the car would start? Should I just wait here and hope for the best? Another thud, louder this time, followed by a long scraping sound again, as if something heavy was being dragged along the roof. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what it was. My hand reached for the door handle, and I pulled it open, stepping out into the rain again. I shone the flashlight upward, pointing it at the car's roof, but there was nothing there, just the slick, dark surface of the car, glistening under the beam. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure low to the ground, crouching in the trees at the edge of the road. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that were too long, too twisted. It was covered in mud, its skin pale and sickly. Its face was hidden by the shadow of the trees, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and predatory. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the door shut and scrambled back into the car, my heart racing. The engine still wouldn't start. The strange figure in the trees was still there, watching, waiting, but now I was too scared to care. I kept trying the ignition over and over, but nothing happened. Panic set in, and then finally it started. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding off down the road. I didn't look back, didn't care about anything else. All I wanted was to get away. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a light in the distance, a small gas station by the side of the road. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I got out of the car. I didn't care if the place was closed. I just needed to be somewhere safe. The station was abandoned. No one was there. I stayed inside, locked the doors, and didn't leave until morning. The sun rose, and the storm finally passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching, and I didn't stop looking over my shoulder the entire way home. It had been a long day of driving. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I turned onto a narrow, winding road that promised nothing but empty fields and darkened woods. The GPS had warned me that I was entering a remote area, but I didn't think much of it. After all, I was just passing through to get to a small town on the other side, a town I'd never visited before but had heard about in passing. I was getting tired, and the faint flicker of my car's dashboard lights reflected the growing weariness in my eyes. I didn't even mind that the road was slowly deteriorating. It wasn't the smoothest route, but it wasn't unbearable either. The road twisted and turned, disappearing into the horizon at every bend, with only the occasional light from a distant farmhouse piercing the darkness. A part of me felt like I was driving into nowhere, the kind of nowhere where people go to disappear, where the world seems to slip out of focus, and you feel like you're the only one left. The trees on either side of the road grew taller, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air outside was cool, but not enough to warrant rolling down the windows. I kept the radio off, too, not wanting anything to break the eerie silence that seemed to grow as I drove deeper into the woods. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The only sign of life had been the occasional farmhouse, each one looking more abandoned than the last. The lights in their windows flickered, or sometimes didn't exist at all, their dark silhouettes standing as sentinels against the backdrop of an ever-encroaching night. I wasn't used to driving like this in such an isolated place, but there was no turning back now. My mind wandered, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a feeling I could describe easily, nothing overt or obvious, but something about the stillness of the place, the heavy weight of the silence pressing in, made me uneasy. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights approaching behind me, but each time, the rear view was as empty as the road ahead. As I rounded another curve, my headlights swept over a sign that had been partially obscured by overgrown vines. It looked like the sign had been abandoned, old and worn, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The name on the sign was barely legible, but I could make out the word Halton, which must have been the name of the small town I was heading toward. I was nearly halfway through the woods when I noticed something unusual. A light up ahead. It wasn't the bright white beam of a car's headlights, but rather a soft, flickering glow. At first, I thought it was just the light from a house, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't. It wasn't like a porch light or even a street lamp. It was different, pulsed in and out, like it was trying to stay alive but failing. I slowed down, curiosity gnawing at me. I come this far, and a small part of me thought I should check it out. The other part, however, screamed for me to turn around and get out of there. I hesitated. It wasn't the kind of place you pulled over for curiosity. Not in the middle of nowhere like this. But before I could make up my mind, the glow disappeared. Just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. A strange sort of relief washed over me. Whatever it had been, I wasn't going to find out. But then something strange happened. In the spot where the light had been, a shadow moved. I blinked, twice, but the shadow remained. It was too large to be a tree, too defined to be a trick of the light. Something or someone was out there watching. My heart began to race as I pressed my foot harder on the gas. The road ahead seemed to stretch further into darkness. The trees were pressing in tighter now, their branches seeming to reach for me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. As I drove faster, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The empty stretch of road had now taken on a menacing quality, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface of my mind was now a full-blown panic. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But the feeling persisted. Couldn't shake it. I was too far into the woods to turn around now, and the thought of retracing my path through those dense trees only made my anxiety worse. I drove faster. The glow came back, flickering from behind the trees once again. Only this time it didn't disappear. It grew brighter, almost as if it was guiding me forward. Suddenly, the road took an unexpected turn, and I had no choice but to swerve to avoid driving straight into a steep drop-off. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel and braced myself for the worst, but somehow, I managed to keep control. The tires screeched on the gravel, and my car slid sideways, but I regained my grip and veered back onto the road. I didn't dare look back. Whatever was out there, whatever was following me, could have caught up by now. I wasn't taking any chances. As I turned another corner, the headlights of my car illuminated a large, abandoned building in the distance. The flickering light seemed to be coming from there. A warehouse of some kind, long past its prime. The structure looked to be crumbling, with large windows boarded up and the door hanging half open. It was the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie. Isolated, dark, and forgotten. I was about to pass it, but something in my gut told me I needed to stop. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the need to find out what that light was, or maybe it was a deeper, more instinctive pull. Something urged me to park and get out. I pulled over, the car engine's hum now replaced with an unsettling silence. The building loomed ahead of me, a monolith against the backdrop of the night sky. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at it, weighing my options. There was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I got closer, the strange flickering light became clearer. It was coming from inside the building. I could see it now, moving across the walls in rapid flashes, almost like a strobe light. I reached the entrance, hesitated for a moment, and then stepped inside. The sun had long since set, leaving only the distant glow of streetlights behind me. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. The highway stretched endlessly, an empty, dark ribbon winding through fields and woods. I was alone, with no service on my phone, and a sense of isolation that seemed to close in with every mile I drove. It had been a long day, and I was just trying to get home. My GPS had started acting up, and I had made the mistake of taking a detour, hoping to avoid the heavy traffic on the main roads. What had started as a shortcut soon turned into a long, winding path through nowhere. I didn't even know the name of the town I was heading toward anymore, just that it was supposed to be a small place with a motel. The motel was the only reason I was still going. I had no other options. The darkened landscape around me was unsettling. A thick fog had started to roll in, seeping in through the trees on either side of the road. The headlights of my car barely made a dent in the thick mist. I tried to keep calm, but something in the air felt off, something I couldn't explain. The road, now barely more than a narrow strip, twisted and turned like a snake, and the occasional pothole made my car jolt, waking me from my daydreaming. I glanced at the clock, 3:42 a.m. I had to stop. My eyes were heavy, and I could feel the weight of fatigue setting in. There were no towns around, no signs of life, just trees and darkness. But I knew I couldn't keep going. My mind felt foggy, and the last thing I wanted was to drive off the road because I'd nodded off. I spotted a small dirt shoulder a few yards ahead. It was a risk, no telling what could be lurking out there, but it was better than pushing my luck. I slowed down, turned off the road, and parked the car. The engine died with a soft hum, and the world around me fell completely silent. The fog was thicker now, pressing in like an unseen weight. I couldn't see much more than the outline of the trees surrounding me. My headlights illuminated a small patch of dirt and weeds, but beyond that, nothing. I reclined my seat, trying to get comfortable. The thought of sleep felt like a luxury. My eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, I almost drifted off. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching on the gravel just outside my window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I sat up straight, my senses on high alert. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the footsteps didn't come closer. They just stopped. Maybe it was a deer, I told myself, trying to rationalize the sound. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That was no deer. I waited, trying to steady my breathing. The sound didn't return, but the unease didn't leave me. I turned the engine back on, ready to pull away if anything felt off. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The fog had thickened, and the headlights only lit up a small distance behind me. Everything looked still. I debated whether to stay put or leave. There was no one else on this road. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason to feel like I wasn't alone, right? Just then, I heard it again. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the dirt, came from behind the car at the back, near the trunk. My heart thudded in my chest. I gripped the wheel, my hands sweaty. There was no way it was an animal this time. Something or someone was out there. Slowly, I turned the ignition key, easing the car forward, ready to peel away if I had to. But then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there was a figure standing just outside the reach of my headlights, barely visible through the thick fog. The shape of a person standing completely still. Panic shot through me. Who would be out here at this hour? And why were they just standing there? I thought about the nearest town. It was at least 30 miles away, and I had no idea if there was anyone around. I considered calling for help, but my phone was dead, and there was no signal. I couldn't stay here, not with that person so close. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. I didn't even look back. My eyes were locked on the road ahead, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The fog seemed to close in on me even more as I drove faster, my headlights barely cutting through the haze. Every turn in the road felt like it could be the one where something was waiting. Every tree, every shadow became a potential threat. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, a cold presence that I couldn't shake. I must have driven for another 10 minutes, my car speeding along the empty road, the faintest sound of tires on gravel the only thing I could hear. Then I saw it, lights. Real lights, not just the dim glow of my headlights. A cluster of lights appeared through the mist, flickering through the trees. It was a small building, maybe a cabin or a diner. I didn't care what it was. I needed somewhere safe. I pulled into the parking lot, heart still racing. The fog was so thick I could barely see the outline of the building in front of me, but the lights inside were bright. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, just listening. The car was silent, the world around me muffled in the thick fog. I stepped out, hesitating before walking toward the entrance. The door was ajar, and the quiet inside made it feel abandoned. But then I saw someone standing behind the counter, a man with dark, tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded when he saw me. "You lost?" he asked, his voice raspy from the smoke. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just needed a place to stop for the night." "You're lucky," he muttered. "We don't get many travelers this far out." He gave me a strange look, like he was trying to figure me out. "What's your name?" I hesitated, but answered, "Anna." He didn't reply right away, just took a long drag from his cigarette and stared out the window. "You should be careful around here," he finally said, flicking the ash into a tray. "It's a strange place. People come and go, but you never really know what's out there." I blinked, unsure if he was being cryptic or if I had missed something. He shook his head as if clearing a thought. "Sorry, long night. Just stay inside tonight. Don't wander off." The warning wasn't lost on me, but I didn't have the energy to press him further. I asked for a room, paid, and made my way down the hall. The motel room was small but clean, the kind of place where time felt frozen, stuck in the past. The bed creaked when I lay down, but I didn't care. I needed sleep more than anything. I thought about the figure in the fog, the strange feeling that had followed me. I thought about the man behind the counter and his odd warning. But exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a dreamless sleep, the fog outside pressing in against the windows. Morning came, bright and cold, and when I opened my eyes, the world felt different. The fog had lifted, and sunlight streamed in through the small window. But something was wrong. The man behind the counter was gone. The motel was completely still, quiet. As I packed my things, I glanced at the window, noticing a shape on the horizon. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a figure, standing still in the distance. I left quickly, heart still pounding from the strange events of the night before. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing in the fog anymore. No figure, no strange shapes, just the road ahead. But the feeling didn't leave me. I didn't stop at that motel again. Couldn't. The memory of that night, the figure in the fog, the man's warning. It all stayed with me. Some places, some roads are better left unexplored. And sometimes the scariest part is not what you see, but what you can't explain. I never should have taken that detour. It was a normal drive. I was heading home after a long business trip, the kind where you're away for a few days working and staying in a sterile hotel room. I just wanted to get back to my place, where I could relax, kick my shoes off, and put the entire week behind me. It was late, around 11:30 p.m., and the highway was quiet, almost eerily so. I'd been driving for hours, and everything was perfectly fine until I decided to take that exit. I don't know why I did it. It wasn't like I was in a rush to get anywhere or had to change my route. But something about the winding road that branched off the main highway caught my attention. There was a sign, "Scenic Route," and I guess in the back of my mind, I thought it might be a nice change from the endless black asphalt and headlights blurring past me. I took the exit and immediately felt the atmosphere shift. The road narrowed, the asphalt turning rough and cracked in places. Trees started to crowd in on either side, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal hands. The lights of the city slowly faded behind me, and I was left with nothing but the hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights illuminating the road ahead. First, it wasn't so bad. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the kind of quiet that you only get when you're far from civilization, the kind that makes you feel like you're in your own little bubble, removed from everything else. I opened the window just slightly, the cool air rushing in, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I could forget about the endless meetings and the emails that were waiting for me at home. It was just me and the road. But that sense of calm didn't last long. The trees started to thicken, and the road grew even more winding and uneven. My headlights flickered every now and then, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. I tried to ignore it. I knew this route was going to be a bit remote, but I hadn't expected it to feel so empty. There was no other car in sight, no signs of life anywhere. I passed a few abandoned houses along the way, their windows dark and hollow, like they hadn't seen a soul in years. A chill crept up my spine, but I told myself it was nothing, just the solitude. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I slammed on the brakes, my heart jumping into my throat. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else. The figure stood motionless, like it was frozen in place. I slowed down, trying to make out more details. The headlights illuminated the figure, and I could see that it was a man. He was tall, with a dark hoodie that obscured most of his face, and his hands were buried deep in the pockets of his coat. I could see nothing but the silhouette of him, and I was struck by how odd it was that he was standing there in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night. I rolled the window down just a crack, and when I did, the air smelled wrong, like something had been rotting for far too long. I quickly rolled the window back up, my fingers trembling as I reached for the gear shift. Something about the whole situation was setting off alarms in my head, but I didn't know what to do. The man didn't move. He just stood there. I honked my horn. I wasn't sure why, but I guess it was an instinct. The man didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the noise. He just stood there, his back slightly hunched, his head lowered as if he was waiting for something. I was starting to panic now, my mind racing through a million different scenarios. What was he doing out here? Why wasn't he moving? I shifted into reverse, but before I could even press the gas pedal, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A car, another car, appeared behind me, its headlights gleaming bright and aggressive in the rearview mirror. But the thing was, I hadn't seen the car coming, and the road behind me had been clear just moments ago. The car was close now, too close, and that's when I realized it wasn't just any car. It was a van, a dark-colored van, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see who was inside. My stomach dropped. The van stopped right behind me, its engine growling in the quiet night. I didn't know what to do. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I glanced back at the figure in front of me. He hadn't moved, still standing in the middle of the road like some kind of strange sentinel. Part of me wanted to call the police, but I couldn't do that. I had no idea where I was, no signal on my phone, and no one nearby who could help. The van's engine revved, and I could feel the vibrations of it through the seat of my car. I wasn't sure if the driver was trying to intimidate me or if they were simply waiting for me to do something. I glanced between the rearview mirror and the figure in front of me. The air felt thick, suffocating. I had to make a choice. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas pedal, my tires screeching as I accelerated forward. I wasn't sure what I expected to happen, but I wasn't about to stay there and wait for whatever this was to unfold. The figure in front of me didn't move. It was like he wanted me to hit him, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. I sped around him, my heart racing, and in that moment, I thought I'd made it, escaped the strange situation. But as I passed the figure, something caught my eye, movement behind me. The van was following me. I could see the headlights reflecting in the rearview mirror, and I knew they weren't going to let me go easily. The road ahead was narrowing, curving sharply through the trees. I pushed the pedal to the floor, desperate to get away. The van stayed close, too close, as if it knew the road better than I did. I swerved around the sharp turns, my knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no one else out here, no help.
No escape.
Suddenly, the headlights of the van flickered. Just for a moment, it looked like the van had stalled. Couldn't believe it. Was I really going to make it out of this alive? But no. The headlights flared back to life, and the van sped up again, its engine roaring like a beast behind me. I could hear it getting closer, and then, with no warning, I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, blocking my path once again. It wasn't the man from before. No, this time it was something else. A woman. Her hair was matted, her face pale, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. She didn't move, just stood there in the middle of the road, her arms hanging limply by her sides. The van was only a few feet away now, and I had no choice. I swerved again, this time to the right, aiming for the ditch on the side of the road. The car slammed into the dirt, the tires screeching as I struggled to regain control. But I couldn't stop. The van was right there, its headlights blinding me as it roared past. I could feel the air shift as the vehicle sped by, the sound of the engine still vibrating in my chest. For a moment, everything was silent. I had no idea where I was now. My heart was still pounding, my body shaking with adrenaline. I slowly brought the car back onto the road, taking deep, shaky breaths as I tried to steady myself. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just kept driving, kept pushing forward until the road straightened out and the trees began to thin. Finally, the road opened up. I saw a sign in the distance, a familiar sign, one that marked the beginning of the main highway again. Couldn't believe it. I had made it. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept going, putting miles between me and whatever that was. I knew I would never take another detour again, never go down an empty road in the middle of nowhere. And that was the end of it, or so I thought.